can make a quick announcement. Is that all right? For Ally.
All right, here we go.
Hello? Hey everyone, I have a quick announcement for you. My name is Brendan Smith. I'm on the board of Outclass and I'm helping to organize Ally Week this week. That's going on right now. Woo! So I wanted to personally invite all of you to come to our next event, which is right after class at 12 o'clock in 260, the big room where we do the quiz reviews. We're going to have a screening of the film Trevor. It's a short film, 20 minutes, and a Q&A with the director afterwards. Trevor won the Academy Award for Best Short Film, and it inspired the creation of a multi-million-dollar nonprofit, the Trevor Project, dedicated to outreach for suicide prevention in the LGBTQ community. So I really hope you all can come. There will be food, so come have lunch with us, show your support for Ally Week, and 12 o'clock right after class in 260. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Okay, so a couple of things. One is, as you know, there is one more quiz left in this class. Just one. And what I'm trying to tell you is the next 4 weeks are, you're going to get stuff coming at you from every direction, right? Which means that this might be one of the last weekends you have to kind of catch up with stuff. So I really meant it when I said that last capital structure, the spreadsheet that I sent on Monday that most of you probably haven't opened yet. It's actually a chance to get caught up on about 4 weeks of project stuff that you've been putting off because you got other things on your table. And I said it does violate the Little Red Hen principle. If any of you have read The Little Red Hen, it's this old book. It's one of those children's books. And it's like the ant and the grasshopper kind of thing. Have you ever read of the Aesop's fable about the ant and the grasshopper? Though in those stories, essentially, there is an industrious hen that does all the work, and there is, of course, this non-industrious, I don't even know what creature it is, that's dancing around. And then winter comes around, and the little red hen starts to bake stuff based on the person who's not been working says, hey, I'd like some bread. And the hen says, you never work, so you can't get the bread. You're saying, what's this got to do with the project? Let's face it, within each group, there is probably one person who's caught up completely, about 3 people who are kind of caught up, and 2 people who say, what project? Okay? And if this was like the ant and the grasshopper and the little red hen, you'd get to the 15th week and you'd say, you never work, so tough on you. The only problem is your grade as a group is such a function of those people as much as it's you. So this is my way of saying, hey, I know you haven't even looked at the project, but I'm going to let you get caught up with that industrious person in your group. It's not fair that you get caught up so quickly. But I think as a group, you're going to be better off if the person who's not work catches up with you. So really, if you can spend 15 minutes on that capital structure spreadsheet, it's going to save you about 4 weeks of work on your project in terms of getting you caught up. I will put up an in-practice webcast this Friday on using that spreadsheet. It's actually a fairly simple spreadsheet, but there are a few little things you might get stuck on, so you can check out what those inputs are if you get stuck. But it will do the rest of the work for you. So let me get back to where I was on Monday. I was talking about coming up with the question of, is my bank under-levered or over-levered? Is my insurance company under-levered or over-levered? Is my investment bank under-levered or over-levered? And what I said was, that question is very difficult to ask at a bank or an insurance company if you think in terms of, do I have too much debt? And the reason it's difficult is defining debt for a bank or an insurance company or investment bank is close to impossible to do. So I said you got to turn your focus with financial service companies to equity. And the question you got to ask is, do I have enough equity? And that question is driven as much by regulatory considerations as anything else, because to survive as a bank or an investment bank as an insurance company, you got to meet a regulatory capital requirement. So this becomes the focus of financial service firms. Anybody doing a financial service firm for your project? Good, because then you listened. There's a reason I steered you away from bank. It's not that you cannot do corporate finance for a bank. But what have I just said? To do corporate finance for a bank, you need to understand regulatory capital requirements. And I felt that you have enough to do already in this class, that the last thing you'd want to be doing is reading the Basel book on regulatory capital for 3 weeks, because that's the only way you can really address this point, is you really need to understand the details of regulatory capital. So if you're running a bank, here are the 3 broad ways you can think about how much regulatory capital should I have. The first is you can say there's a regulatory requirement. As long as I stay above it, I'm okay. So you look at those ratios and you feel that this is a game, that you got to keep it above that regulatory capital requirement. And as long as you do that, you're safe. The only problem is you're one shock away from not being safe. Like what? You probably read yesterday that Goldman has, the last holdout has finally agreed, I think what, $5 billion. Probably by the time all is said and done, that's going to be about $1.5 billion with the tax write-offs, etc. But that's $1.5 billion that's going to come out of the regulatory capital. So if they were at the regulatory minimum, a $1.5 billion shock will basically put them below the minimum. So there is this argument that maybe you need a buffer, something to put on top of the regulatory capital just in case something happens. But let me ask you a question. What if tomorrow I wiped out regulatory capital requirements? And you are a bank. Would you still keep regulatory capital or the equivalent of regulatory capital? No? I mean, remember, regulatory capital requirements for banks are only about 100 years old. They're post-depression. Were there banks before 1930? The Rothschilds have been around, what, 700 years? They've maintained regulatory capital. You know why they maintained regulatory capital? The idea here is you need some capital to protect yourself in case things go bad. Banks through the ages have always maintained capital. All that the regulatory capital requirements do is they come in and put this as a rule for everybody in this business because they're worried about that systemic risk issue, which is if you go under, your depositors now don't get their money back and there's a social cost to be borne. So all I'm saying is banks, investment banks and insurance companies that view this as a game, and many of them do. It's a game where if you can find loopholes and get away with having less regulatory capital, you're going to become more valuable as a bank, are missing the point. And for a decade, that's exactly how banks viewed regulatory capital requirements. Pre-2008, they said, hey, we can get riskier businesses into riskier businesses because Basel doesn't even recognize this business. They're not going to ask us to put up that extra regulatory capital, so we're fooling the regulatory capital guys. Well, how well did that work for you? You might have fooled the regulatory capital guys, but when housing collapsed, you discovered why you needed regulatory capital, that without regulatory capital, you were in deep trouble. So think about regulatory capital ratios, but also think about what do I need to maintain as a bank or an insurance company or investment bank to be safe. And that's the essence of thinking about the debt and equity mix for a bank. Any questions on financial service companies? Now let's talk about why. So when you get a chance and you enter the numbers for your company, you're going to come up with an optimal. It's actually going to pop up right next to your inputs and say your optimal debt ratio is 10%, 40%, 70%. And it's going to be like a black box. You're saying, this is good, let me plug the number in and move on. What I'd like you to think about when you get that optimal is why. Why is my company's optimal only 10%? Or why is it so high that it's 80%? So I'm going to give you the drivers of the optimal debt ratio that you're going to get out of this analysis. And you can start thinking about your company already without even entering the numbers to think about what kind of optimal should I expect to get. Here's the first factor that drives your optimal. It's whatever marginal tax rate you enter as a tax rate for your company. So one of the inputs I ask you in the spreadsheet is, what is the marginal tax rate for your company? And if it's a US company, that marginal tax rate is going to be 40%. But if it's an Irish company, it might be only 12.5%. You're saying, so what? I took my 5 companies that I showed you the optimal for last session, and I just changed the tax rate. I left everything else unchanged. Same operating income, same default spread, same beta. Changed just the tax rate. And as I lower the tax rate across the board with every company, notice what happens to my optimal. In fact, if I make my tax rate 0, the optimal debt ratio becomes 0% for every one of the companies. Large companies, small companies, mature companies, growth companies, it doesn't matter. If I take away the tax benefits of debt, there is no good reason for borrowing money other than the fact that you don't want to issue equity, or you cannot issue equity. So if I make my tax rate 0, your optimal debt ratio is going to go to 0. So if your company has a really low marginal tax rate for whatever reason, don't be surprised to see a really low optimal debt ratio, an optimal debt ratio of 0%. In fact, one thing I'd suggest is do your optimal with the right tax rate, then just play with it. Lower it by 10%, 20%. Because there is talk that maybe next year corporate tax reform is coming to the US, and one of the things that both parties are talking about, this is very unusual, is lowering the corporate tax rate from 35% towards 25 to 28%. Just try the 25% then, see what happens to your optimal. And you should expect to see your optimal debt ratio decrease. So that's the first factor. Here's the second. Yes? So you're asking, should you use a marginal tax rate or an effective tax rate, right? So that's really the question. Because did everybody get the question? In most of your companies, in the 10K, there's an effective tax rate, and then there's this marginal tax rate. The marginal tax rate has nothing to do with your company. It comes from what country can you get your tax savings in. The effective tax rate reflects the fact that you are deferring taxes, you're a global company, you have trapped cash, etc. So somebody want to address that question, which tax rate should you use when you do the optimal capital structure? And why? But why? Why is it that, see, why should, I mean, in fact, I'll give you the statistics. The average effective tax rate for US companies is 25%. The marginal tax rate is 40%. That's going to make a big difference, right? So you're right, it should be the marginal tax rate, but give me the logic. That's not the reason, because even if you did not have interest, the effective tax rate just takes the taxes paid divided by, it's accrual taxes divided by accrual income. So if you didn't have interest expenses, you'd have more taxes and more income. So the rate itself might not be affected by the fact that you have interest expenses. Yes? In fact, last weekend was a very depressing weekend for me because I had to file taxes. I'm always depressed that week, of how much money I end up paying. And one of the things I compute, actually, just to keep myself even more tortured, is I look at how much my interest expenses save me in taxes. Okay? They don't, my effective tax rate, and if I use any kind of tax program, at the end they say taxes paid divided by taxable, they take your taxes paid divided by adjusted gross income and say if your average tax rate this year was 23% or 26%, my interest always saves me taxes on the last dollar of income. In other words, if I have $1 million in income and $100,000 in interest expenses, I report $900,000 in taxable income and I save taxes only on the last $100,000. So even if your effective tax rate is 15%, for computing the optimal debt ratio, you're going to use the marginal tax rate because that's where you save taxes. Or to be more specific, if you're looking at Apple, the effective tax rate is only 15%. But guess where they borrow their entire $60 billion in debt? It's all in the US, and the interest expense on that $60 billion is used to offset their highest taxed income, not their average dollar, not the lowest dollar. So in fact, it makes your life simpler. You don't have to worry about effective tax rates. You can go with the marginal tax rate. Okay. Second factor that drives your optimal. The way I describe this cost to capital approach is I said this is an approach that's based on earnings and cash flows. It looks at the capacity to service debt based on earnings and cash flows. Which means if you have a lot of cash flows as a company, you should be able to borrow a lot more money. You're saying cash flows relative to what? Cash flows relative to the value of the company. In fact, I'm going to use a very simple metric to illustrate this, where I'm going to take the EBITDA as a measure of total cash flow that my company throws off, and divide it by the enterprise value. If you remember, is market value of equity plus debt minus cash, market value of the company. A company that has a high EBITDA relative to its enterprise value, throws off a lot of cash flows relative to its value, will be able to borrow a lot more money than a company which has very little in cash flows. In fact, let me connect this to the point I made about Baidu being a growth company and why growth companies will not have high optimal debt ratios. Does Facebook make a lot of money? It actually does. It makes about $6 billion. But what's its market value? It's about 200 billion plus. 6 billion divided by 200 billion is about 3%. Coca-Cola makes about 6 billion in cash flow too, but its market value is only 60 billion. 6 billion divided by 60 billion is 10%. When we compute debt ratio, remember we compute an optimal debt ratio. When I compute Facebook's optimal debt ratio and I say it's 20%, you're saying that's low. 20% of 200 billion is 40 billion in debt. So when you talk about optimal debt ratios, if your cash flow is low relative to your firm value, you should expect to see a much lower optimal. So what I'm suggesting, in fact, as a group, when you sit together and you look at your optimals and they're different, say, why are optimals different? Focus on the tax rate, but also focus on how much your company is generating as cash flow. Use EBITDA or EBIT or whatever you want to use as a proxy as a percentage of the market value of the firm. So yes? Okay. Okay, the question was, what happens if you have a holding company and subsidiaries? Okay, let me ask you a follow-up question. Are these consolidated subsidiaries or, I mean, remember there are two ways that subsidiaries are recorded. If you have only 20% of a subsidiary, then it doesn't show up in your revenues, your operating income, etc. If you have 55, 60, 70, 80 or 100%, it's already part of your EBITDA. So when you compute the holding company numbers, the EBITDA you're getting is actually the collective EBITDA for all your subsidiaries. The debt you're getting is the collective debt for all your subsidiaries. So when you look at your holding company, you're in fact looking at, does my holding company get enough debt across the subsidiaries? The problematic cases are when your subsidiaries are not consolidated. Because then the operating income you're going to see for the holding company will not reflect the subsidiary. And if the holding company is borrowing for the subsidiary, then you're going to get a mismatch. So what you're looking for is, are my numbers matched or mismatched? So follow through and see if your subsidiaries are fully consolidated. If they are, your problem went away. If they're not, then you have some cleaning up to do. Right? Yeah. Any other questions? So that's the second driver. The third driver, of course, is an obvious one. If your company is a risky company, its optimal debt ratio should be lower, holding all else constant, than if it's a safe company. Risky or safe in what sense? In terms of having stable income. And there are two places it shows up in your optimal. One is through the unlevered beta. If you're a company with a low unlevered beta, because your business is safe, you should be able to borrow more money than a company with a high unlevered beta. Because you start off with a high operating risk, borrowing money is going to magnify that risk. The second place it will show up is through the ratings. And here, unfortunately, the spreadsheet doesn't do a very good job. I mean, let me explain what I mean by this. Remember that interest coverage ratio lookup table we had? No, I said if your market cap is greater than 5 billion, you tell me your interest coverage ratio, I'll guess your rating. It's kind of a nice way of getting a rating, but here's the problem. I have two companies. They're both $10 billion companies. They both have interest coverage ratios of 8.9. I'm going to say give them both AAAs. But let's assume that one company has very, very volatile earnings. Your interest coverage ratio just reflects last year's operating income. I'll wager the ratings agency is going to differentiate between those two companies. The company with more unstable earnings will have a lower rating than the company with the more stable earnings. So in the real world, the way it's going to show up is your ratings will become much more sensitive to interest coverage ratio changes if you're a risky company. So if you do this right, it's going to show up in your numbers through either the rating or through the unlevered beta. Riskier companies will have lower optimal debt ratios than safer companies. Which brings me to my final variable. And this is the only macroeconomic variable that seems to drive whether you should borrow more money. I'll tell you a story that I keep reading over and over right now, which I think is a very dangerous story. Interest rates are low, right? I mean, it's not debatable. Risk-free rates are around. Much of the US, all of Europe are low. In fact, in some currencies, they've even become negative. I know at least a couple of people in this class who are working with Swiss francs. And guess what? Your risk-free rate is below zero. So let me tell you the story, and you tell me what I'm missing. So here's what the story says. Because interest rates are low, it's cheaper to borrow money than to raise equity. So companies should borrow more money. Sounds pretty reasonable, right? Because interest rates are low, debt becomes more attractive relative to equity. What's wrong with that story?
Because we've already said in almost all cases, cost of debt is lower than cost of equity.
No, but this is it's even lower, right? Interest rates are even, so maybe the spread gets wider. What goes into a cost of debt? Risk-free rate plus a default spread. You're right. As risk-free rates go down, holding default spreads constant, the cost of debt will go down. What goes into cost of equity? The same risk-free rate plus an equity risk premium. When the risk-free rate decreases, it's like a tide in a lake or an ocean, right? Everything goes up when interest rates go up. Everything goes down. When risk-free rates are lower, both the cost of equity and the cost of debt will be lower. So anybody who says the optimal debt ratio will be higher today because risk-free rates are lower, just try it out. It doesn't work. But I'll tell you what could cause the two to deviate. What do I add to the risk-free rate to get to my cost of equity? An equity risk premium, right? Multiplied by a beta, of course, but the equity risk premium is the price of risk in the equity market. What do I add to the risk-free rate to get to a cost of debt? I add a default spread. That's the price of risk in the bond market. So you guys be the bond market, you guys be the equity market. You're setting a price for risk in the equity market, the equity risk premium. You set a price of risk in the bond market, it's a default spread. Most of the time, the two move together. What do I mean by that? If people get scared, there's a crisis, both equity risk premiums and default spreads go up. If you're feeling really good, the price of risk in both markets comes down. But there have been periods, especially in the last 25 years, where the two have moved in opposite directions. Let's pick the first one. 1990s. See this blue line here? That's my equity risk premium, the implied equity risk premium. So think of that as the price of risk for equity. This black line below is the default spread on a BAA rated bond. I've just picked one rating to kind of capture what's happening to spreads in the market. So in the 1990s, tell me what's happening to the equity risk premium? It's drifting down, keeps going down, down, especially in the late 90s. In fact, there was a point in time at the end of 99 where the equity risk premium was 2%. You saw that originally as an equity risk premium graph. So you guys are charging me only 2% for risk when I issue equity to you. And default spreads had not changed very much. They were also at 2%. So if I'm a company, I can issue equity at this incredibly low cost. Why? Because you're charging a very low price for risk. Or I can borrow money at a default spread that I was paying 5 years ago. What should I do? If I were a CFO at the end of 99, I'm saying, should I use equity or should I use debt? Given that the price of risk for equity has dropped and the price of risk for debt hasn't, what am I going to be tempted to do? I'm going to issue equity like it's going out of style. So that's a case where the price of equity risk dropped, the price of debt risk stayed high. I went out and issued equity and in fact, that's what happened. In the late 90s, companies were issuing equity because it was a cheaper way of raising financing than debt because the price of risk had diverged. That, of course, got fixed, the dot-com boom bust, and then you got to 2001 and you had 9/11. And Alan Greenspan said, I will not let the economy go into recession. The hubris of central bankers. And he created what was called the Greenspan put, which is, he said, one way I'm going to make sure the economy doesn't go into recession is I'm going to pump up the bond market. What does that mean? If you look at what happened to post 2001, what happened to default spreads each year? The default spread started about 4% and they keep dropping. And so by the time, if you look at the default spread, they've dropped by almost 50% between 2002 and 2007. So you're the bond market. For whatever reason, because you trust in Lord Greenspan, you've lowered the price of risk by 50%. But if you look at the equity risk premium, it hasn't changed very much between 2002 and 2007, stays around 4%. So you guys are pretty stable in your price of risk. So let's move forward to 2006 or 2007. I'm a company trying to decide whether I should raise debt or equity. The debt market has halved the price of risk. The equity market hasn't changed very much. Guess what I should be doing? I've created the golden age for the LBO, right? Because I borrow money, I set the price based on the bond market, and then when I buy equity, it's at the old price of risk. You're encouraging me to borrow money like it's going out of style. There have been very few market crises over the last 100 years that were created by the bond market. Usually it's the stock market guys who lose their heads and then drag the rest of the world down with them. The 2008 crisis was a bond market crisis. It was a bond market crisis because the spreads got too low. And that shows up in lots of different forms, right? The subprime crisis. What's a subprime crisis? It's not that you lent to people who had bad credit histories. That's not a bad business if you charge a high enough interest rates. When we say default spreads are too low, you're charging too low an interest rate given the inherent default risk in whatever you're lending against. So in 2007, the opposite happened. What causes this tilt between debt and equity is not what the risk-free rate does, but what the equity risk premium does relative to the default spread. So starting in 2008, I track both numbers every month. I do the implied equity risk premium at the start of every month. I also go check out the BAA default spread because I want to make sure that if the two numbers start to diverge, that I start to get aware of it fairly early in the process because I know there's pain coming somewhere along the way if the two numbers move in different directions. So if you want to see what the BAA default spread is, if you go to the Federal Reserve site in St. Louis, you can actually get it each month going back as long as you want, I think to 1919. So you can get this long history of what default spreads in the US have done, almost for 100 years, just by looking at that graph. Because that tells you what the bond market is thinking, what the price of risk is in the bond market. So those are the four variables that drive differences in optimal. The fourth variable, all of you share. But the first three, what's my tax rate, how much do I generate in cash flows, how risky am I, are specific to your company. And one reason I asked you to try to be diverse in your company choices is if you've been diverse, then there are going to be big differences across your companies in those variables and consequently big differences in the optimal debt ratio. So try to get this part at least nailed down. Put your numbers in the optimal capital structure spreadsheet. Don't view it as a black box. If you can do it, try one debt ratio. Make sure you understand how the numbers come out. Right? See what your actual debt ratio is. See what your optimal debt ratio is. Look at how going to your optimal changes your value as a firm. So remember how we did that for Disney? The spreadsheet does it for you, but you can still see where it's coming from. Because that's going to be the first part of making this judgment on, does my company have the right amount of debt? Any questions on the cost of capital approach, the enhanced cost of capital? Elliot?
Do you incorporate that spread, or?
It is actually, the way we use it, we use the current spread, right? The question you got to ask yourself is if that current spread is too low, maybe you're borrowing money to lock in a market mistake the bond market is making. And you got to maybe step back and say, what if the bond market... So basically the companies that borrowed a lot in 2007, in 2009 when the spread bounced back, had an issue because they had to go back to refinance the debt. So in the cost of capital spreadsheet, the default spreads are the current default spreads. And you can look at those. The current default spreads are not wildly different. So we're not like 2007 and 99 where you have big differences. But I'd keep my eye on that spread because as it shifts over time, it could affect your optimal debt ratio. But it's happening because one of the markets here is making a mistake in assessing risk. Okay. Any other questions? Now I'm going to give you a third way to come up with the optimal. Okay. It's called the adjusted present value approach. And if this were the University of Chicago, this is the only approach you would do for capital structure. They're pretty rigid about this. This is a cost of capital approach, horrible approach. We have a better way of doing it. It's called the adjusted present value approach. Yeah. Yeah.
If we are trying to set a debt to equity ratio for a long term,
Right.
and this is changing with the market, how often?
Well, how often? Actually, that's a good question. The optimal debt ratio that you get is an optimal debt ratio for right now, reflecting the equity risk premium today, the default spread today, your operating income today, your market value today. Could that change tomorrow? Absolutely. Does that mean you have to compute your optimal every day? Please don't. But it does mean that you do have to compute it at intervals. I suggest to companies they do it at least once a year. That's the first suggestion. The second is, I suggest that they not show too much hubris about knowing what their optimal is. I got at least a half a dozen emails after the last class, probably from number crunching people, on why I wasn't being more specific. Remember, I walked in 10% increments? They said, can't you set up the Excel spreadsheet to optimize this? You can. You know what the spreadsheet will give you? An optimal debt ratio of 41.893544%. That's the most dangerous place to be in finance, is to have the illusion of precision when it's not there. Why is it the illusion of precision? Because all the numbers I fed into the spreadsheet were estimates subject to change. So that's the other thing I would suggest, is when you get that optimal of 40%, it's not a formula. It says you have to go to 40%. You still have a judgment to make. And if you're in a business where you think the inputs are going to change a lot, you're in a risky business, you might hold back when you go to the optimal. You might go to 30 instead of 40. So it doesn't mean you don't do the optimal, but you leave yourself a buffer depending on how uncertain you feel about the company and the macro environment. I'm going to be in Brazil in June, and they asked me to do corporate finance for Brazil today. It's going to be quite an experience, because you know what they're all worried about. They've stopped thinking about their companies. At this point in time, the company's gone to the 10th in line. The first 9 people in line are all, what will the president do tomorrow? Who will be the president day after tomorrow? So this has become macro issues. But those macro issues play a role, right? Because I could compute the optimal debt ratio for a Brazilian, take MBA. I could compute the optimal debt ratio, but that number could change tomorrow if Dilma is impeached. And I'm going to factor that in. I can say, that's not my problem. I'm going to do whatever I can. You still have to build in that buffer, and that's what I would suggest, is build in a buffer the more uncertain you are. Right? Yes?
You have two tables as well, spreads in the spreadsheet, and the first one says large manufacturing companies.
The spreads are the same. The ratings are different. The only difference between the two is the rating I give you for an interest coverage ratio is higher if you're a larger company than a smaller company, but the spread should be exactly the same, right? It's a non-financial service company is really what I meant, because financial service companies play by their own set of rules. They have different, it's almost like you go to the bond market, you have two sets. No. So if you, and since nobody's doing a financial service company, I hope, it shouldn't be an issue. So that should be the spreads for pretty much everybody in this class. So let's talk about the adjusted present value approach. Here's what you try to do in the adjusted present value approach that's different from the cost of capital approach. In the cost of capital approach, the way we try to capture changes in the debt ratio is through the cost of capital. And we said, you move to a better mix of debt and equity, your cost of capital decreases, your value increases. In the adjusted present value approach, you do something entirely different. You actually start with what your company would be worth if it had no debt. Yeah, we'll talk about how to get that. So think of that, it's called an unlevered firm value, but basically you're saying if my company were an all equity funded company, what would its value be? That's your starting point. Then you look at the debt you're going to take on, $1 billion, $3 billion, $5 billion, and you compute two numbers. The first, you compute the expected tax benefits you will get from that debt. Now what are those tax benefits? That you're going to get interest expenses. The interest expenses are going to save you taxes. You take the present value of those tax savings. That gives you the tax benefit of debt. And then you ask yourself a second question. By borrowing this money, you've increased your chance of going bankrupt, right? So you compute an expected bankruptcy cost from the debt. So you got the value of the firm with no debt, plus the tax benefits of debt, minus the expected bankruptcy cost. You've essentially got a value for the firm with debt. What's different about the APV approach is rather than trying to adjust the discount rate for debt, I'm keeping debt separate and looking at the tax benefits and the expected bankruptcy cost from coming. And my objective stays the same. I want to maximize the firm value. I look for that dollar debt level at which my firm value is maximized. So let's go through the mechanics of doing this so you can see why people often take shortcuts. So there are 3 steps here. First, you want to start off by estimating the unlevered firm value. There are 2 ways you can get that number. The first is to get the cash flows to the firm, which are pre-debt cash flows, and discount them back at a cost of capital you would have had if you were all equity funded. Would you be able to give me that? If you are all equity funded, all you have is a cost of equity, right? And if you have no debt, that cost of equity should reflect what beta? Unlevered beta. It's as simple as that. Put in an unlevered beta, come up with so it's like problem 1 on quiz 2. If I'm pulling a scab off, sorry, just put the scab back on. No. It's the unlevered cost of equity. So basically, I'm going to discount the cash flows back at the unlevered cost of equity and come up with an unlevered firm value. That could be a lot of work, though, because that's a full-fledged valuation. Let's say you don't want to do that. Here's the other way you can do. You know the market value of the firm is right now, right? Market value of equity plus debt minus. So you have the value of the firm. Can you tell me what that value would be if you had no debt? If you had no debt, you could take out the tax benefits. So you could take the existing debt, take out the tax benefits you're getting from that debt, and maybe add back whatever bankruptcy cost you created. You could back into an unlevered firm value from today's value. It'll save you some time because now you're saying, I'm not valuing the company, I'm just using the market numbers. You have an unlevered firm value. That's not difficult to do. We have the mechanics, we can get it done. Second stop, the tax benefits of debt are pretty straightforward to value because we know what they are. It's the interest expense providing you tax benefits over time, and the present value of those interest benefits over time, and this is pure magic, works out to be whatever your dollar debt is times the tax rate. You're saying, but it's only the interest tax savings. The present value of interest tax savings as a perpetuity works out to be the dollar debt times the tax rate. So if you borrow $5 billion, your tax rate is 35%. You're going to save 35% of $5 billion is your tax benefit. So you get the unlevered firm value, you get the tax benefits of debt. Now comes the tricky part. You need an expected bankruptcy cost. To get an expected bankruptcy cost, you need 2 numbers. You need a probability that you will go bankrupt as a function of your debt, and you also need to tell me what the cost of bankruptcy is. What's the cost of bankruptcy? It's a deadweight cost of ending up in the legal system if you go bankrupt, plus the indirect cost of bankruptcy, which includes people might not. This, you can see how difficult this is going to be to observe, right? Because it's unobservable. The fact that people don't show, so you got to measure how many people didn't show up in your showrooms because they read about the story. So here's what happens in practice, especially for people who come through the rigid school of APV is the only way to do things. They get the unlevered firm value by hook or by crook. They add the tax benefits of debt because that's pretty simple to do. Then they get to the expected bankruptcy cost and they start waving their hands saying it's too difficult to do. And they don't do it. So here's what APV ends up in practice. It's unlevered firm value plus tax benefit and you're done. Let me save you the trouble. If that's the way you're using adjusted present value, how much should you borrow? I've counted all the good stuff, right? And none of the bad stuff. You should never stop borrowing money. This is why LBO guys love APV. No matter what they do, it looks good. You take the unlevered firm value, I borrow $900 billion. $900 billion times 40% is $360 billion. Add that on to an unlevered firm value. This is going to work out great. So if you run into people who come with this APV toolkit, and there will be a few that you will run into at work, maybe this summer, maybe next summer, maybe whenever you run into a capital structure discussion, ask them about expected bankruptcy cost in their APV. And if they say, well, what are you talking about? They really aren't doing adjusted present value. They're doing this half-assed APV. Maybe we should create that as a new version of APV. Half-assed APV where you don't bring in expected bankruptcy cost, you count all the good stuff in. So I'm going to try to do it right. I don't like the APV approach particularly, but I can take you through the mechanics of what you'd need to do this for Disney. So I'm actually going to compute an expected bankruptcy cost by trying to get a number on the probability of bankruptcy, and I'll lead you through how I come up with that number, and trying to put a cost to bankruptcy based on studies that have looked at companies that have gone bankrupt or on the verge of bankruptcy. It turns out that the direct cost of bankruptcy is about 5 to 10% of value, and that's pretty stable across companies. What's the direct cost? That's the legal cost of actually ending up in the bankruptcy courts and the lawyers taking their share, 5 to 10%. The indirect cost of bankruptcy can range from close to zero for a grocery store to 30 to 40% for an airline. Remember, we talked about different companies having it. It can range from 0 to 30, maybe even 40%. That's a big range. But I'm going to try to grapple with it, because without it, I can't use the APV approach. So for the probability of bankruptcy, I'm going to cheat. Remember how we got the synthetic ratings for our companies in the cost of capital approach? We did that because we used those ratings to come up with the cost of debt. Now I'm actually going to use the ratings to come up with a different number. Every year, Ed Altman has been doing this update, where what he does is he takes every rated bond, and he computes every rated bond from 10 years ago, and he computes what percentage of bonds in each ratings class defaulted over the following 10 years. So it's a very simple empirical study. It goes back to 2007 and says, let me take every bond from AAA down to D. Let's see what percentage of these bonds default over the next 10 years. No surprise, if you're D rated, you've already defaulted. So that was the easy part of the table. If you're C rated, 85% of those bonds don't make it through the 10 years. And as your rating improves, your default spread, the probability of default decreases. But remember what I said, no AAA rated company or AA rated company is defaulted while it was rated AAA or AA. That remains true. But even AAA rated bonds, 0.07% of them do default over 10 years. I know this is cheating, but here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to compute the rating at every debt ratio that you have. And I'm going to take that rating and use that rating to estimate a probability of default. So this is going to give me at least 1/2 of that expected bankruptcy cost is the probability of default. I'm going to try this on Disney. So let me start out by trying to get an unlevered value for Disney. A value for Disney if it had no debt. The value for Disney as a company right now, with its existing debt, is $137.539 billion. I'm going to use the second approach. I don't want to do the full-fledged valuation because I'll be jumping ahead. So I know the current market value. Question?
When you say tax benefit on the current debt, right, there's an underlying assumption that debt is constant.
That this debt is a permanent addition to the debt, right? And that's the difference with the APV approach. The APV approach works with dollar debt. It doesn't do a debt ratio. In the cost of capital, we made a similar assumption, but it's a percentage of value. So we say it's 30% of value. So if your value increases, the debt increases as well. APV is a dollar debt based approach. So it's for that dollar debt. Exactly.
That fluctuating year by year, you have to calculate the tax benefit per year, right? Not as a
This is really about looking at the total debt you have as a company and saying, should I add to that debt? So think of this as a decision you're making at the company level. I'm at 6 billion debt, should I go to 8 billion, 10 billion, or 12 billion? So you can re-estimate that next year, but it's for that dollar debt level. Right? So first thing is I know the value of the firm right now is 137.5 billion. That's what the market estimates the value to be. So I'm going to take the market as a starting point. Does the market know that Disney has debt right now? Of course it does. It's public. And in fact, we know exactly how much debt Disney has. It is $15.96 billion in debt. So here's what I'm going to do. Let's assume Disney pays off that debt. It becomes an all-equity funded company. The first thing that's going to happen is the tax benefit from that debt is going to disappear, right? That 15.96 billion times 36.1%, which is in the value today, will go away. So I subtract it out. That's the bad news. What's the good news? If they pay off the debt, any expected bankruptcy risk they had with that desk will also disappear, and that becomes an add. So you notice why I'm subtracting out the tax benefit and adding back the expected bankruptcy cost. I'm saying, what if Disney did not have its existing debt? The unlevered value that I get for Disney as a company is $132.3 billion. One way to read that is right now, out of Disney's value of $137.4 billion, $5.2 billion is coming from the fact that they have debt. And if I took that debt out, that value is going to go away. Now, in making my estimate of the expected bankruptcy cost, I base the likelihood of default, 0.66%, on the rating they have as a company. They're a single A rated company. The 0.66% reflects their current rating. The 25% of the value I'm making an assumption. 5 to 10% of that is direct bankruptcy cost. I'm putting the indirect bankruptcy cost for Disney right in the middle, somewhere between either extreme. It's not 0%, it's not a grocery store, but it's not 35 or 40%, it's not an airplane manufacturer. You're saying, why 25%? Why not? This is not, and this is my problem with APV, is this number is going to drive your optimal debt ratio. And the reality is, it's a number that's almost impossible to nail down. So if you let me play with that number, I could make it 20, then 15, then... So maybe at the end of this process, you might get a clue as to why I picked 25%. But I really have no good reason. It could be 20, it could be 30. I don't think it's going to be the lowest. And all I can say, it's a neither extreme. Okay? 25%. So that's my value for Disney if it has no debt. So one line on the table is done, right? With 0 debt, the value for Disney is going to be 132.3 billion. Now if I go to 10% debt, 20% debt, you know the processes, right? At a 10% debt ratio, I'm going to compute the dollar debt. So I'm doing exactly what I did with the cost of capital approach. I compute the dollar debt. But instead of computing an interest coverage ratio and a cost of capital on it, I use that dollar debt to come up with a rating and a probability of default as well as an expected bankruptcy. So as my rating changes, my probability of default goes from 0.07%, the AAA level, all the way down to 85%. Because by the time they get to 90% debt, their rating is down to single C, the probability of default gets huge, the expected bankruptcy cost gets huge. The tax benefit, very simply, is the tax rate times the dollar debt. The reason, again, the interest expense drops out is you get the interest tax savings each year, the present value, that perpetuity, the interest expense drops out of the equation. The only thing I do that is reflective of what I did in the cost of capital approach is once I get past 60%, I say stop. Don't talk to me about tax benefits of debt, because you just don't have enough income to cover any more interest expenses. So I lower the tax benefit. Yes? Yeah. That's a marginal tax rate for Disney. Disney is one of those unusual companies that if you look at the footnotes, actually breaks out its marginal tax rate. Some companies do it, and they started the federal tax rate at, I think, 35%. They had state and local taxes, so basically added it all up, it worked out to 36.1. But that was a marginal tax rate. If you don't find that for your company, just use 40% for a US company, right? So here's what I'm going to do to bring it all together. The unlevered firm value stays at, that was the easiest column on this table, right? 132.3 all the way through. That's the unlevered firm value. It has nothing to do with my dollar debt. To get to my levered firm value, I add the tax benefit, and then I subtract out the expected bankruptcy costs. So the tax benefit is the good stuff, the expected bankruptcy cost is the bad stuff. In the last column, you see my estimated value for Disney as a company with debt. What's my end game? I want to maximize the value of Disney, right? You look at the last column. Where is it maximized? 40%. That is very convenient, because that was the optimal I got with the cost of capital approach. I said I'll give you a clue as to why I picked 25% as my indirect bankruptcy cost. Maybe I tried 15%, I got too high a debt ratio, and I said that's not going to work, that's going to be really tough to explain in class. Maybe I tried 35%, I got too low. You don't know what my motives were. The reality is that's not what I did, but you will never know. Okay? That's why I don't go to the APV approach, because I know the big number I need is that bankruptcy cost, and that number I have really no way of nailing down. I'd much rather use the enhanced cost of capital approach and bring it through the operating income, where I have a shot at bringing it in, than trying to come up with this number. I have never seen somebody use the APV approach correctly. I've never, and that's a broad statement. I've seen hundreds of investment banks do APVs. I have never, ever seen them do it right. Do it right meaning bringing in the expected bankruptcy costs and dealing with the way you do. So if you do run into somebody who's enamored with this approach, let them run. Give them lots of rope and then hang them. Because the biggest number is gone. There's the expected bankruptcy cost. You're not going to deal with it. Don't talk to me about this as a good way of dealing with debt, because it's really not going to give me a complete picture of debt. and then show them how to do it right? Make up a 25% bankruptcy cost, act like you know what it is, and then go through. Because that's basically what you'd have to do to come up with the optimal. So at this stage, let me bring together what I have. I have the cost of capital approach that gives me an optimal. I have the enhanced cost of capital approach that gives me an optimal, an APV approach that gives me an optimal. And all of these approaches are intrinsic approaches, and none of them is particularly difficult to do, right? They're tedious, but not difficult. So you think companies use some variant of these approaches to come up with their debt ratios. And here's where I have to let you down. 95% of companies don't decide how much to borrow by running a cost of capital analysis or an APV analysis. They look at what everybody else in the sector is doing, and they try to get as close as they can. So if everybody else is borrowing no money, they will borrow no money. If everybody else is borrowing 30%, they'll borrow 30%. And this is not just capital structure, it's what I call Me Too corporate finance, which is you look at everybody else as a Me Too. The fact that Me Too doesn't fit you, you don't care. So I have a question. Why do you think companies are so attracted to be close to industry averages when it comes to things like borrowing money and paying dividends? What's the attraction of being close to the industry average? It's safe in what sense? And it's not that you're not going to make a mistake. It's if you make a mistake, everybody else makes a mistake with you. It's how 6-year-olds view the world. When my youngest was 6, he came home from school and he'd done something he shouldn't have done. No. So I asked him, Kiran, why did you do this? He said, because Dad, everybody else was doing it. And then, of course, the mom jumps in with a classic mom question, which is, if everybody else jumped off the bridge, would you jump off the bridge too? And he gave the classic 6-year-old response. He said, of course, Mom. Do you want me to be strange? This is that 6-year-old mentality kind of worming its way into the CFO's head, saying, if you're going to make a mistake, make sure you have lots of company. And don't underestimate it. And you know what feeds into this? Sell-side equity research analysts who think like 6-year-olds too. Like if you're a company that has no debt in a sector where everybody else has debt, you know what they say? How come you're not borrowing money? And they don't look at your cost of capital, your capacity to borrow money. They look at it, hey, you have a 0% debt ratio, they all have 30%, you must be doing something wrong. Even though you might be the only person who's doing everything right, you're going to get into trouble. So it doesn't surprise me that companies are attracted by industry averages. In practical terms, here's how it's going to play out. You come up with the optimal debt ratio for a company using a cost of capital approach. And you're very proud of it. You show the entire graph. And after about an hour and a half of your detailed presentation, the CFO puts up his hand and says, if we do this, will we look strange? You know what he's asking you, right? I like your analysis. You're telling me to go to a 40% debt ratio, but if I do this, will I look strange relative to my peer group? And if you don't have an answer to that question, all your work is down the drain. So one thing I would suggest you do is when you do the optimal debt ratio for your company, at least be aware of what the rest of the sector is doing. But my problem with just looking at the sector is people seem to throw a lot of data away. When you ask people, how do you measure up relative to the sector, they look at the sector average, they look at themselves and say, well, my debt ratio is lower than the average, so I'm okay. So I'm going to say, if you're going to go with the sector, at least look at the entire data and control for differences between your company and the rest of the sector. What differences? We know what differences drive debt ratios, right? So if you're Ryanair and you're saying my debt ratio is lower than the rest of the sector, therefore I should borrow more money, I'm going to stop you and say, no, don't do it. Why? Because your tax rate is much lower than everybody else's. You shouldn't be comparing yourself to the other airlines because your marginal tax benefits are lower. I'm going to be comparing Disney to the rest of the entertainment sector. The only problem is Disney is by far the biggest player in the sector. Maybe the closest you can get is Time Warner, and everybody else in the sector is a small, risky company in one segment of the market. I would expect Disney to have more debt than the rest of the sector. So I'm going to say, if you're going to play this Me Too game, at least be semi-sophisticated and ask those follow-up questions before you jump in and try to make yourself like everybody else. In fact, go to that trade-off: tax benefits, added discipline, bankruptcy costs, agency costs. Think about how you're different from the rest of the sector and maybe make a judgment on whether you should be above the average or below the average. So I'm going to show you my industry averages. And the numbers I got were incredibly convenient. And you're going to see in a minute what I mean by that. And here I couldn't cook up the numbers. The sector was what it was. What did I find for Disney? Do you remember? Did I find them to be under-levered or over-levered? Under-levered. They had about 14% debt. We said they should have 40% debt. With Tata Motors and Vale, I found them to be over-levered. They had too much debt. With Baidu, I said you're about 5%. You should be at 10, so you're about the right amount of debt. So I had one correctly levered company, one under-levered company, two over-levered companies, right? So I went and looked at the industry average, and I promise you I didn't fix these numbers. I compared each company to a sector. So for Disney, I compared them to US entertainment companies. And I looked at what Disney's debt ratio was, and I used different variants: book debt ratio, market debt ratio, and I compared Disney's debt ratios to the average. So Disney's book debt ratio is about 23%, its market debt ratio is about 12%. Its net debt ratio, if that's the way you want to think about it, where you net cash out, is about 18% with book value, 9%. You think, so what? Let's look at the industry averages. Every single one of those numbers, on whether you define debt ratio as book or market, gross or net, Disney's debt ratio is lower than the industry average. You're saying, so what? I just made my case a lot stronger. If I'm in front of Disney and I do the optimal cost of capital approach and I say your optimal is 40%, I say if we do this, will we look strange? My response is, if you do this, you're going to look less strange than you do now. You're actually going to be moving towards the average. That's an incredibly powerful ad. We'll talk about what happens when the numbers move against you, but here the numbers are pushing in my direction. It makes it easier to sell my recommendation. With Vale and Tata Motors, I compared them to global mining and global automobile companies, and here's what I found. With Vale, on every single debt ratio, I found their debt ratio was higher than the industry average, and with Tata Motors, with every single debt ratio, I found that their debt ratio was higher than the industry average. Why does it help me? Because my cost of capital approach said they were over-levered, and based on this comparison at least, it seems to me that if they pay down the debt, they will move towards their industry average, again helping me in my push towards lowering debt. With Baidu, the debt ratios were all over. In fact, they have very little debt, but relative to the sector, they actually have too much debt, right? Because if you look at the sector, there's almost no debt in the sector, because their sector, nobody borrows money. And that's going to be tricky if I ask them to borrow more money, but since I said you're okay, just let it go. Their question is, maybe we're not okay, maybe should we pay down the debt? And my response to that should be based on, hey, you have the earnings to service this debt. It's not like the rest. I'd have to look at the rest of the sector. Maybe most of them are money losing companies, but it does make sense that you're borrowing a little more than they are. The toughest pitches happen when your cost to capital approach tells a company to borrow more money, but their actual debt ratio is above the industry average. It happens all the time with technology companies I work with, especially aging technology companies. Remember, technology is not a young sector anymore. And because tech companies age in dog years, a 25-year tech company is like a 150-year-old. So in fact, a year and a half ago, I did a blog post on the aging of the tech sector. And here's all I did. I took every tech company and I estimated its age based on its founding date. Then I classified tech companies into 5 groups based on how old or how young they were. This is a very diverse market. In fact, we should never talk about the tech sector as one sector anymore. There's an aging tech sector and a young tech sector. They don't even resemble each other. And one of the things I've increasingly started doing is doing debt ratios for aging tech companies as opposed to young tech companies, because the problem if you combine them all is no aging tech company is ever going to borrow money, because they're going to look at the industry average and say nobody else is borrowing money, but they're missing the point. You're Microsoft, you have the capacity to borrow a lot more than you do, no matter what the industry average is doing. So you have to bring all your ammunition to make your case here, because the CFO and the company are going to naturally push towards the industry average. Don't push back. It's natural to look at the industry average. Tell them what they might be missing by just looking at the industry average. Question? Is negative? Does anybody want to answer the question? First, what's a net debt ratio? What do? I take debt and I subtract out cash. Let's take Apple. How much debt does Apple have? 60 billion. How much cash does it have? 220 billion. So when I take cash, debt and subtract out cash, I get minus 160 billion. So when you have a negative debt ratio, it just means your cash balance is much bigger than your debt. And with the many young tech companies, that's exactly what you're going to find. They have no debt and lots of cash. Why they need to survive? So negative net debt ratios just mean you hit zero and kept going. No. Any other questions? Yes?
And then enhanced capital approach, don't we supposed to assume the direct and indirect default risk in the spread?
No. The way, in fact, the question was in the cost of capital approach, where does indirect bankruptcy cost show? In the traditional cost of capital approach, where does it go? It goes nowhere. We ignore it. When I did the enhanced cost of capital approach, you know how I brought it in, right? I connected the operating income to the rating, and that's why I had to do that, because if I don't do that, I'm going to overestimate my debt ratio because I'm ignoring indirect bankruptcy costs.
So it should change.
Exactly. It should basically mean that your operating income can't stay constant as your rating goes from AAA down to single B, double. I have to adjust your operating income because people are not buying your products, your suppliers are demanding cash, and your employees are leaving. All of that shows up in your operating income. Okay. Yes?
We need to adjust for volatility in the stock market because it could change the market value of certain industry stocks by percentage and impact your debt.
If you're doing them at a point in time, presumably both your stock and the market are affected, right? If I do this for the oil companies today, for instance, it's true oil prices are down, but they're down both for my company. So tomorrow, in fact, I'm going to be in Houston comparing Shell to other oil companies. Guess what? All the ratios reflect today's market values. What gets you into trouble is if you're comparing the debt ratio for your company today against an industry average from 2 years ago. That's why I think it makes sense to update these numbers as you're going along. And one reason I update them on my website at the start of every year is for myself. I need to know what those numbers look like. But even those start of the year numbers, by the time I get to the middle of the year, I might have to reassess if that sector has had a particularly bad 6 months. But as long as you do them at the same point in time, at least you're comparing apples to apples. That actually reminds me, I found this really great article about why apples are actually more closer to oranges than we think. So I'll send it to you in case somebody says, you're comparing apples and oranges, just bring the paper out. It's actually a scientific study showing that apples and oranges are actually similar 93% of the time. Right? So this will actually cut the conversation short about the apples and oranges. It's actually, I'll send it to you. Right? Any other questions? Now let me get a little pseudo-sophisticated. Right? Let's put those statistics classes to use finally. That was a pain, right? Going through that class, learning all that stuff. He said, when in my life am I ever going to do this? Here's the first place. Remember that multiple regression section you did in statistics? Act like you did. No, yes, I remember. What does a multiple regression do? You have a dependent variable and you have independent variables, right? And your objective is to try to explain the dependent variable, the independent variables. Let's bring this to the debt ratio discussion. What's the variable we're trying to explain? Debt ratio. So that becomes a dependent variable. What are the things we worry about are different across companies? We worry about differences in tax rates. We worry about differences in cash flows. We worry about differences in risk. If I could somehow come up with measures of that, maybe I can relate the debt ratio. So if you have 50 companies in your entertainment sector, maybe I can take the debt ratio for each company and look at these variables. Then I'm going to run a regression. But here, I have a purpose. It's not just to show you the R squared, but maybe in this sector, I can show you that companies with high tax rates have higher debt ratios. Companies with high cash flows have high debt ratios, and companies with higher risk have lower debt ratios. But I can go further. I have an equation at the end of my regression, where if you give me your company's tax rate, your Ryanair, and you give me a really low tax rate, and I plug that into the regression, I'm going to come up with a predicted debt ratio for your company, which actually reflects the differences between you and the rest of the sector. It's a substitute for what you do otherwise, which is on the one hand, on the other hand. You do it qualitatively. This is an additional tool. You can still do it qualitatively, but this is one tool that allows you to turn that qualitative discussion into a quantitative conclusion. So let's try this. I took the auto sector. I wanted to see whether Tata Motors was over-levered. It looked over-levered, right, when I compared to the industry average, but maybe I'm missing some big difference between Tata Motors and the rest of the sector. I took the 56 automobile companies that were in my sample, and they range all the way from Volkswagen to small emerging market automobile companies. I took the debt to capital ratio for each company, and I ran a regression against the effective tax rate. You're saying, why didn't you use the marginal tax rate? I wanted to get some measure of these companies were spread out globally, what they were actually paying in taxes, but I could have used the marginal tax rate just using the country tax rate. I used the EBITDA divided by enterprise value. What does that measure? It measures how much cash these companies generate each year. And remember, the more cash you generate, the higher the debt ratio should be. And I looked at how much these companies were reinvesting as kind of a proxy. If you're a growth company and you're putting in a lot of capex, maybe you should be a little more cautious about borrowing money than if you're not a growth company. So each one had a story. Each variable had a story. And I ran the regression. The R squared of the regression is 21%. Am I getting excited about it? It is what it is. You think that's a really low number. Hey, remember, I wanted to use the cost of capital approach in the first place. You are the one who said, I want to be like everybody else. All the R squared is doing is pointing out to you the danger of what you're doing, which is there's a lot of noise in this sector, and you're picking the average. The noise doesn't go away. I'm just making it explicit. But if you take the regression and you plug in the numbers for Tata Motors into the regression, you get a predicted number of 18.54. You're saying, what does that mean? The way I would describe the 18.54% is, given how other automobile companies are borrowing money, and given the differences between US Tata Motors and the rest of the sector, your debt ratio should be roughly 18.5%, with the caveat that because the R squared is 21%. How does that show up in my prediction? If my R squared were 100%, my prediction would be perfect. If my R squared is 90%, there's going to be some range around it, maybe 18.2 to 18.8. If it becomes 21%, the range is probably from 15.5. And if you have any good regression package, it'll actually provide the range. I think the range I got with the 21% R squared is that the debt ratio for Tata Motors should be somewhere between 15% and 22%. Its actual debt ratio is 29%. So don't let low R squareds intimidate you. They don't stop the process, just give you a range. And if your company is outside that range, it's still over-levered or under-levered. And that's one extra. It's basically just replacing an average with a richer estimate that brings into the analysis the differences between your company and the rest of the sector. So when you have your sample, try this out. Yes?
Where do those numbers come from for the variables of 0.63 and 1.01?
Oh, those actually come as output from the regression. So basically, if you have 56 companies in Excel and you run a multiple regression, because given that we have packages, most of the time you can run the regression, you just have to pick the variables. This will show up as output. So the output will say the coefficient on the first variable, the coefficient of the second variable. So the 0.63, the 1.01, the minus 0.93 are output from the regression. The numbers you see inside the brackets are my numbers for Tata Motors. Okay? So try it. Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't for your sector. If you have only 6 companies as your peer group, don't try it. It's too small a sample. But if you have 50 or 60 or 80 companies, this might be the richest way to bring in the data that you have in those companies. So that's a sector regression. Could I do this for the whole market, you think? Why not? It's a big sample, right? That's good. That's the good news. The bad news is now I'm mixing up tech companies with utilities, with chemical companies, with steel companies. But that's not going to stop me. So I just had to run the regression for the entire market for the US. So basically, there's my debt ratio on the left-hand side. And the 4 variables I use for the effective tax rate for companies. What percentage of shares were held by institutions? Why do you care? Remember that added discipline part that we brought in? I'm hoping that this will somehow capture that if you have a company with a lot of institutional holding, then maybe there is less discipline than if you have a lot of insider holding. Okay? Then I computed how variable your operating income was as a measure of, hey, if you're a risky company, you should have a lower debt ratio. And finally, I looked at the cash they had, the EBITDA, and I ran the regression. Before you get too excited about the regression, truth in advertising, my R squared is, I've actually bolded it out so you don't miss it, is 8%. There's a huge amount of variation in debt ratios that have nothing to do with fundamentals across companies. Again, I don't view that as my problem. It's the reality, which is any time I base my debt ratio decisions by looking at the rest of the market, I'm going to run into some serious issues in terms of things I'm not controlling for. So I plugged in Disney's numbers into this regression. I took the tax rate. So basically I took the 5 numbers I had in the regression, I plugged them in, I came up with a predicted debt ratio for Disney of about 19%. If I asked you to just describe this to somebody who's a non-statistics person, how would you describe this 18.86%? What does it tell me about Disney? How would you characterize it? Nobody wants to try? I'll help you out if you get stuck. Elliot?
Based on this set of traits that you identified and the average of the market overall, as those traits apply for Disney, this is the predicted debt ratio.
Based on how other companies in the market are borrowing money, and based on Disney's difference from those companies, this is what I would expect Disney to borrow. It's just like an optimal given how everybody else is behaving. So should that number be the same as the optimal I got in the cost of capital approach? For it to be the same as the the debt ratio I get in the cost of capital approach, what do I have to assume?
You have to assume all the companies are optimized.
In other words, I have to assume that all companies are behaving, they don't have to be all optimized, but they're all at least trying to move towards, that they're behaving rationally. And that might or might not be true. And let me explain why this can give you a very different answer. In the mid-1990s, Korean companies had these incredibly high debt ratios, every one of them, 70, 75, 80%. And the Korean government was partly to blame because the Korean government often gave an implicit guarantee to banks saying, if you lend to Hyundai or Samsung or whoever else, and you get into trouble, we will back it up. So not surprisingly, companies said, we'll go out and borrow money, we get the tax benefit, somebody else bears the bankruptcy costs. So I remember being in Korea in the mid-90s doing a session on a corporate finance session, and I was computing, I took 5 Korean companies, I computed the optimal, and every single one of them on the cost of capital approach, I came up with the optimal debt ratio of 30 to 40, and they were at 75%. So if you looked at the cost of capital approach, they all looked over levered. Then I ran a regression across Korean companies. And guess what I found? They were all doing exactly the right thing, given how other Korean companies were borrowing. So what regressions do is they feed into your debt ratio whatever mistakes companies might be making on average. If they're borrowing too much, this number is going to be really high. So it's a different judgment on what your company can borrow. And in fact, it's a separate way of thinking about debt ratios. If your company says, look, I don't care about my optimal, I just want to be like everybody else. Here's the answer. So here's what I have for Disney and for my companies at this point. I had the operating income approach, which I didn't go through, but it's really based on how much can they borrow relative to the operating income. But the cost of capital, the enhanced cost of capital, the APV approach, and comparable to the industry in the sector. Let's take Disney. Its actual debt ratio is about 11.6%. Based on operating income, it should be at about 35%. Based on cost of capital, with either approach, it should be about 40%. Based on APV, with my cheating on the bankruptcy cost, it should be about 40% too. And relative to the industry, I could do a simple average, or I could do that regression prediction. No, I get 28.5 or 19%. On every single number, Disney looks under levered. So this was an easy one. Disney clearly has excess debt capacity. Notice what I didn't say yet, that they should borrow more money. That's the next step in the problem, whether they should jump to the optimal. But clearly they look under levered no matter how I measure the optimal. With Vale, their actual was about 35%. With the cost of capital approach, with the actual operating income, they had only 30. But if I said they can normalize iron ore prices, which is the China problem kind of coming into my capital structure, I come up with 50. With the enhanced cost of capital approach, it varies between 30 and 40%. With the APV approach, I get about 30%, and relative to the industry, I have 26%. There's a little more mix, but again, it looks over levered on most of the comparisons. With Tata Motors, I had 29% relative to every other number there. It looks over-levered. And with Baidu, it looks slightly under-levered if I compare it to any cost to capital approach, but it looks slightly over-levered if I compare it to the industry average. And that's why you need to have, at this point, when you do this for your company, you might have 3 different numbers, but you have to make the final call. And sometimes it's easy, like it was for Disney, and sometimes you have to decide which of these approaches do I trust more, and that's going to drive how you think about the optimal. I know you guys want to get out, but I want to get started on the next piece. And actually, this ties to what we did in the optimal. Elliot? Yeah. I'll still use it because, in a sense, you get the same problem with an average, right? An average is like a regression with an R squared of 0. You're just taking the constant, right? So even if it has a low R squared, I might make it more explicit and give you a range. That I think is the most sensible thing to do, is give you the total range that I get from a predicted value. So if your R squared is low, the range is going to be larger, right? Because otherwise I'm sitting there saying, what's the threshold for my R squared? Should it be 20%? Should it be 25? And that's a very tough line to draw.
But even with a very low R squared, even without a range, like you can take the perspective that there's a wisdom of crowds thing, right? Where the optimal.
It's a wisdom of crowds, but the crowd is not giving you a specific number. It's giving you a range then. So the wisdom of crowds there has to be taken with a grain of salt. The wisdom of crowds, the crowd is very mixed up right now. So they could take off in either direction, so I'm going to give you the whole. So even there, I would still make the range explicit. Oh, there is. Eventually, the truth catches up, right? Because it's not a wisdom of crowds. It's the reality of cash flows. Because you can all sit here and say, oh, we can keep borrowing money. Nothing bad will happen. We can all convince ourselves nothing bad will happen until something bad happens. Okay? So that's like the housing crisis. What ultimately brought it to the top is people actually started defaulting. How dare they? The models say you shouldn't be defaulting. But once that triggers, and that's, I think, the reality in this process, and that's why the cost to capital approach kind of brings you back to reality sometimes, because it forces you to think about how much money are you making. I don't care, everybody's borrowing money. So I think by having all those approaches, you have both whatever the crowd is doing right now, also the question of what can I actually borrow based on what I'm making. Yes?
So if R squared is a measure of how many firms are actually using fundamentals to get to their optimal debt ratio?
Not necessarily. Yeah, in fact, let me back up. That's not the way I would read R squared, which is, you're right, you can talk about it, they're using fundamentals, but it really might be how much do fundamentals drive debt ratios. Okay.
So have you found any industries where you see R squared much higher, so that it might be the case
I have never done this on an industry by industry basis, but I wouldn't be surprised if that were true. There are some industries where utilities, for instance, where your debt decision is driven a great deal by cash flows and interest coverage ratios and ratings. It's probably much more sensible than technology companies. Okay? So I would say the less diverse a sector becomes, the higher the R squareds you will end up getting for your numbers, simply because everybody's kind of bunched up around something. And because the business is stable, you found a steady state. You're not going to get this overshooting and undershooting. Right? But no, I've never done a comparison across sectors. So let's get this next piece at least started. Right? So here's where we are. We have the optimal mix of debt and equity. I want to do 2 things. One is once you come up with the optimal for your company, you have to tell me what to do next. So I'm going to get started on that. Then after you've told me what to do next, then we're going to come back and ask what kind of debt should I use? Long-term, short-term, fixed rate, floating rate. Okay? So here's my last slide for today, and here's what I'd like you to start thinking about if you do the capital structure spreadsheet this weekend. So you're going to do the optimal capital structure. You're going to come up with an actual debt ratio for your company in your optimal. One of 3 things is going to be true. Your company might be one of those very unusual companies which is very close to its optimal. What do I mean by close to the optimal? You're at 36.5%, the optimal is 40%, just let it go. Don't say my company is massively under-levered. It's not. Because remember, when you say the optimal is 40, what are you saying? It's somewhere between 35 and 45, right? So it could be that your company is one of those companies in which case, what should you do? Follow the Hippocratic Oath. Do no harm. Don't sit there saying, I have to make a recommendation, otherwise this report is going to look really short. So even though there's nothing wrong, let me tell them to do something. which is the classic consultant's problem, right? You walk into a company, it's already well run, you tell them you're well run, they're going to say, why did I hire you in the first place? You make up 15 pages, you should do this and you should do that, and then you leave. And by the time they do all those things, they go from being a well-run company to a badly run company. So if you have a company that is at its optimal, let it go. Let's take the two other scenarios. Your company could either have too little debt or too much debt. Those two problems, which one would you rather have? Have too little debt. We've talked about this repeatedly. It's a much more easily fixable problem. And here's what I want you to think about. If your actual is different from the optimal, I'd like you to tell me how quickly or gradually I can move from the actual to the optimal. In other words, your optimal is, for Disney for instance, 11.6%, the optimal is 40. I'm going to take you through the process of, hey, do they need to jump to 40% right away, or do they have the luxury of time? And I'm going to give you a framework for doing that. And if I decide they should go to the optimal over the next 3 years, the next 5 years, I then have to fill in the gap of what kind of debt they should use to get from where they are now to that optimal. So try to get your optimal for your company done by Monday, because when we talk about doing this in class, maybe you can do this part of the project in class while I do Disney, because it's actually a fairly simple process of making those final two judgments. Yes?
This spreadsheet doesn't work with Excel 2006.
I opened it in my Excel this morning with 2016. Let's see.
So if you go to the,
That's right.
this is my, this is
Oh, that's not yours.
this one's. So this doesn't update.
I didn't read what's in there. You see an iteration box with the words? No, it's not there. Okay.
I had a weird kink in it, and I was like, I can't lean on it.
That should be. Which is common for Japanese companies because they're allowed to buy back shares.
So that's the same share sitting in like a treasury.
It would actually affect your corporate governance.
Yeah, so that's, so when they say internal, that's right, that's the internal, right? So that'll, okay, yeah. And the secondary list is more interest bearing, right? And they just don't get a rating for them, I guess they would never. Should I assume they're like a triple rated, A rated, and then, well, they have other rating pieces that I'll have to do.
No, you can actually use the rating spreadsheet and do a synthetic rating by converting the lease into leases. So it's actually the circular reasoning. So what it is, start with the AAA rating, and come up with a lease debt value. So we multiply the lease debt value by that AAA rating, which creates an interest coverage ratio, which then
Which should be the triple A,
let's say a company with 50 billion in leases and no conventional debt. We start with a AAA rating, but once it
as it continues to go, it'll, oh, okay. And that's one of your spreadsheets?
the lease spreadsheet will have it. The present value of the lease spreadsheet will have it.
Perfect, okay, thank you.
Okay. Yep.
I'm taking the effective tax rate to calculate the levered beta and loving it, so is it okay?
Do some margin.
So it would be like, if it's not given for a company, I assume it would be for
Country. So use the country, use the companies incorporated.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the other question, okay,
Here, really quick question. So you're doing Altman and they bought Publica. How is it's very small holdings. Do I need to calculate?
It will already be consolidated.
Okay.
When did they buy?
A few years ago.
It will all be consolidated. It's all consolidated. It's fine.
Okay, perfect. And outside of your office hours, which conflict with all of my classes, can I email you for now? Okay.
When you have a private practice, you have the square, you need to divide by the square root of